everyone, to our next episode on the Loins of History. This is Jay, and I'm joined by my co-host Collin. And today we're going to be continuing our series on American political foundations, discussing the political theory behind the American politics. We did our last episode on some of the political ideas that led up to and through the American Revolution. And on this episode, we're going to be talking about post-revolution Constitution. Going to have a very exciting discussion on the Constitution and why it's important. But just to recap real quick, last week, some of those ideas that we're going to see in the Constitution this week, we talked about natural law, how that was an appeal to a higher power. We talked about separation of powers and how a government needs to have checks and balances. For us, that's the separation between the judiciary, the executive, and the legislative branches of government. We talked about liberty versus power and how the two are complementary and not opposed to one another. We talked about representation and how representation factors in to consent to the governed. Also, just wanted to give a quick shout out to our new supporters for this podcast, to Jody and Mike. Thank you so much, Jody and Mike, for supporting this podcast. You can do that two ways: by going through the Support This Podcast on Spotify or checking out our Patreon page as well. And with that, turn it over to Collin.
Thanks, Jay. This is a really important topic to understand. So I think that understanding the Constitution and why it is important is a fundamental necessity, not just for American listeners, but for everyone worldwide who values liberty. Right now there is a definite political and cultural war being fought between the left and the right, conservatives versus liberals. And I would wager that most people don't really grasp the concept of liberty and what the founders were trying to create and ultimately protect with the Constitution. And, for progressives, how can you move forward when you don't really understand where you came from? Trying to erase the past is not going to heal the wounds of previous injustice. And without a firm foundation, to be honest, you're basically just a rudderless ship being tossed to and fro on a whim, and you're just guided by forces who control means of information and influence. And today it's one injustice, tomorrow it's another, and it's this never-ending personal revolution. And on the other side, for conservatives, what exactly are you conserving? Is being a conservative nothing but waving a flag and having a support the troops sticker, back the blue? If you're going to conserve the ideas of liberty the way the founders intended, like you claim in what being a conservative claims to be, you have to have a knowledge of liberty. You must be a student of the Constitution and our founding. Otherwise, you could very easily be fooled by some grandiose speech and saber rattling, which ultimately is going to give power back to tyrants in the name of freedom. So I believe that you can both progress while conserving our fundamental value of liberty. The founders, this is crazy to think about. The founders at their time would be considered radical progressives. A lot of them actually did want to abolish slavery. We don't talk a lot about Lafayette, but he became a French general in the U.S. forces, but he implored the founders to abolish slavery and wrote about it. He went back to France to help with their revolution. Ultimately was chased out of the country during the Reign of Terror and spent some time in jail. But they were radicals at the time, progressive radicals. And I know it's weird for us to think of in the 21st century with our morals being the way that they are. But these founders put us on a different path. This idea of liberty really took root, not just in North America, but in Europe and ultimately the rest of the world afterwards. So we must understand that during the founding of our country, like the fate of the U.S. was precarious at best. And our founders were walking this razor edge trying to form this new republic. They had to contend with, England, the superpower of England, breaking away and then protecting the colonies from that external threat. And then they had to deal internally. You had to unite 13 colonies that were very different, and they had very different ideas for how they wanted to be governed. So they could not, I think ultimately they could not be as radical as they wanted in a lot of ways, because they had to make different compromises, which we'll talk about a little bit more. But I think that really, with that perspective, it really humanizes them. Like I mentioned last week, we can't deify, we can't vilify. We really just need to humanize them to try and understand what they were trying to do. And those that setting us apart, setting us on a different path, had they not done that, we would not be able to enjoy the freedoms that we do today. And, whether, for, with the ideas of slavery and women's rights, a lot of that looked back to the founding, to the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and use that as I guess, as a foundation for what they claim to be their natural right as well. So with that being said, I just think I look at this as, if you're going to, like in building a house, if you need a firm foundation, and this is what Jay and I are trying to talk about today. So Jay, sorry
No,
for that bit of a tangent right there, but what are your thoughts on that?
no. So you bring up a lot of really good points, and I think it's important for us to kind of cover this before we start digging into the details of the Constitution, because I really liked your point about for progressives and conservatives, it's the Constitution doesn't belong to the right. Like it feels sometimes that that's like kind of what culturally where we're drifting towards, that like again naturally, oh, it's the Constitution and we're supposed to protect it, and if you're on the left it's like, the Constitution was riddled with errors, we need to redo this thing, when in reality you bring up a great point, and that is like the founders in their day were political leftists. They were not like the right in that day were monarchists. To be a Republican in the 1700s sense of the word was to be on the political left. This is pre-Marx, pre-Hegel, pre Engels, that the a lot of those ideas, socialism being the big one, kind of influences the left. None of those existed at this point. So when we're talking about the Constitution, it's important to remember that conservatives, if we're going to conserve the Constitution, we have to remember that in its own day, it was a document of the political left, so to speak. So to speak. I know that is a tough pill to swallow for a lot of folks, but to even say those words like feels like, what?
I know it's a paradigm shift for how we have to think about our founding, and I think it's an important one. You're right.
I've always wrestled with the idea of, what's the to be a conservative, what creed are you actually adopting? And the older I get, the more for most Americans, what they mean when they say I'm a conservative, that just simply means I want to retain the past. The problem with that is there were a lot of bad things in the past. Right? And it just depends on what we're talking about. There's good things in the past that we should retain, and there's bad things in the past that we need to change. So it's like there's really no guide or no founding principle there. So when we talk about the Constitution, we really have to come up with a better argument than this is just the way that it's supposed to be.
Well, I think even the founders, when they designed when they framed the Constitution, they put in place a means to make change in amendments. There is an amendment process. Now, they made it difficult for a reason, because in John Adams' Thoughts on Government, he talks about, I think he gives the example of Holland at the time, with the legislative branch basically just voting for themselves to have more power and longer terms, and basically becoming tyrants. So they make it a difficult process, but not an impossible one. We have passed many amendments that extended rights and the, you know, what is proclaimed, we know these truths to be self evident that all men are created equal, to extend that to people who are not necessarily included originally. This is a bit of a vindication of them. And we talk about the times and understanding them. I think I know for a fact, and we and historians have gone through and pulled records of many of their thoughts on slavery, and many were against slavery. And we ask ourselves, why didn't they just abolish it outright federally? And a lot of states did. I think 8 of the 13 original colonies within the time of founding abolished slavery. And they put in methods and means in place to make that change, albeit slower than what we even now can say, hey, that was too slow. They put in a means to make changes by passing laws. But back to my original point, there's means to amend the Constitution. They put that in there because they knew that the change would be necessary in order to extend these rights. So there is a way to make these changes, and we've done it before.
I think it's important that we kind of reveal our biases to our audience before we really get going here in the Constitution. But what we're trying to do here is we don't want this podcast to become like you know, a partisan tool. We kind of want to both criticize and praise truth wherever we find it, right? Yeah, we're definitely just trying to contextualize the Constitution where it's at before we get started in or in this conversation.
So Jay, I think with all of that being said and all of that preamble, did the founders get the Constitution right? I think that's probably the first thing we need to answer right now. And I'm going to read a quote by James Madison from Federalist 51. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external nor internal controls on government would be necessary. In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this. You must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it to control itself. A dependence on the people is, no doubt, the primary control on the government, but experience has taught mankind the necessity of auxiliary precautions. I think that summarizes the struggle that a lot of the founders were going through when they framed the Constitution. They needed to apply what we talked about last week. They sought natural law to legitimize the Constitution, an appeal to the Creator. They needed, and it's spelled out, they needed the consent of the governed, and that's kind of what James Madison refers to here. They needed the consent of the government in order to pass laws to protect liberty. And then they had to wrestle with this idea of, okay, once we get the consent of the governed, how can we limit and create checks and balances within this government so that it can still be effective and still protect liberty at the same time?
Yeah. It's kind of funny you mentioned that because generally speaking, I think the founders got the Constitution right. And it's because of they properly understood human nature, and that human nature kind of devolves, keyword there, uh, into this, into corruption. And the best way to, stay that off as long as possible is checks and balances. And kind of what Madison was saying here is that it would be great if the government was completely beholden to its people, but experience has taught us that that's not the case. So we need to put certain things into the Constitution to prevent the government from doing certain things.
Well, it's funny you say that. There's a Thomas Jefferson quote: "Every government degenerates when trusted to the rulers of the people alone. The people themselves are its only safe depositories." Kind of like we talked about last week with Balin. The citizens are themselves a check on government power, and
Mhm.
again, along the lines of why we're doing this, you have to consistently hold your elected representatives accountable. Consent is something that is continuous. It's an
Right.
involved process. It is day in and day out because, as Jefferson said, as Madison said, that left to its own devices, government will become more tyrannical.
I feel like what makes governments, or what makes societies collapse, so to speak, is not because they got a specific, rule wrong. You can change rules, right? But rather, what makes governments really go downhill is unchecked corruption, the slow decline. You mentioned, Colin, in an earlier episode, you mentioned how the founders were students of the classics. And the Roman Empire was very much one of the key case studies that a lot of these dudes grew up studying. And the Roman Empire, it's not that they got one rule wrong, and that's what made Rome fall. In the same way that Rome wasn't built in a day, Rome didn't fall in a day. What made Rome go downhill was they started off, as a republic. The republic gradually gave its powers away to the dictator. The dictator was, or the, Rome writ large was dependent upon whoever the dictator was. If it was a good dictator, things were good. If it was a bad dictator, things were bad. More often than not, you got bad dictators. Power struggles ensued because the Senate was no longer a good check on the dictator. And that created a weak government, a corrupt government that, when external pressures and internal pressures, overlapped, everything fractured and fell apart. Yeah, and then I think that's one of the things that they were trying to prevent.
Wild to think about, but who I personally consider the last, or where the Roman Empire began its true decline, Commodus. From Commodus to Romulus Augustulus in 476, that's about 300 years. The Western Roman Empire's decline was longer than we've been a country. J-
Yeah,
Sidebar, sorry.
yeah.
Just a thought.
No,
And so,
no.
yeah, that's that slow decline. It happens I mean, it is gradual and it's generational. I mean, it is not something that it's like, well, we had one bad leader and everything went away. It's like, no, you've had generations of bad leaders and a populace who is no longer concerned with their liberty, their freedoms, the empire or the country, to use your term, writ large. um, it really becomes a problem. And that, here today, there's a lot of writing, and within the Federalist Papers about the passions of the people and guarding against that. So we on one side within the Constitution want to guard against tyranny and government overreach, while at the same time there's a check against the people. And okay, well, if we have one, and it's only one legislative body, and that's it, and it represents, some states have more representatives than say other states. Well, those big states are just going to vote in their interest, and they're going to impose their own tyranny on these smaller states. And that's one of the concerns that happened in the Constitutional Congress between, it was ultimately called the Connecticut Compromise, but you had the Virginia Plan, the New Jersey Plan, and you had big states wanted the representation this way, because they wanted it to favor them, and small states did not. And that's where you get, the House of Representatives, which is based on population, and then the Senate, which is two senators per state, and it guarded against majority and minority tyranny, and it allowed the legislative bodies to focus and represent equally. So and it's really an unbelievable idea if you think about it, that they were able to get enough states to agree on this. And there were some problems, like with the Three-Fifths Compromise, obviously very bad, but it's really incredible that they were able to get them to agree to this. And it's one of those, I think, where they got it right with the lower house and the upper, and it's really pretty incredible. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. No, no, you're right. It's important to remember that when the Constitution was being written and ultimately ratified, a lot of compromise went into it, right? There were warring factions in the in the convention over a lot of different things. And it's important to remember that when, compromise solutions, some people praise compromise, other people call it like half solutions, right? That are ultimately just create more problems in and of themselves. But the reality is like when we seek to strike something or change something in the Constitution, it's important to understand what both sides of the original argument were, right? And on your point about a bicameral legislature, the tyranny of the majority is to this day still a thing. Uh, I saw a tweet yesterday about Wanda Sykes made a comment on a talk show about how it's like and this is I'm not quoting her right now. This is the J paraphrase version, but she was commenting like most of the people in this country live in New York and California. Why do we have to listen to all those people in the middle of the country when the majority of us live on the in New York and California? And, the thought was like, wow, that's literally called tyranny of the majority. And there are certain checks against that because that doesn't create a good society. Uh, and oh, by the way, people are leaving California and New York at the rapid rate and flocking to cough, cough, the very areas that she was criticizing. So it's like, all right, today, those are the majority populated country, but 10, 20, 30 years from now, at the rate that we're going, they're no longer going to be the populated countries. And should the political right then at that point in time, look at California and New York and go, "Oh, now we're the majority, so it sucks to be all." No, the tyranny of the majority is always wrong, and we need mechanisms in our government to prevent against that.
That that is a great point, and I don't know if it was. And I'm going to paraphrase. I think it was Sun Tzu or something like that. But they're basically like, don't inflict such a heavy blow on your enemy that they would come back and do it to you. It's kind of the same thing. It's like, well, today, 51% of the people of the country want to do this.
Yeah,
Okay. Well, what happens when you vote for that and you now? And so this is something else we need to consider. Like you said, today, yes, 30 years from now, what happens when suddenly you are no longer part of that 51% and you have now consented and given up that liberty, that freedom, that check? That law has now been changed because you wanted it at the time.
yeah,
Now you are no longer part of the 51%. And suddenly you are now being oppressed. You are living under the boot of tyranny. That's what people need to consider. Stop thinking in terms of right now and think of terms of, okay, yes, I'm not necessarily getting everything I want right now, but years from now, my liberty will ultimately be protected. And there are
right,
means in order to make changes. So yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think it's important. So prior to the Constitution, let's add, like we said, we're going to contextualize. Let's add some more context to what was going on with the Constitution. So prior to the Constitutional Congress and the Constitution being created, we had the Articles of Confederation, and that was what was created after the Revolutionary War. And basically, it was a government. The way I see it, government set up to fail. There was one legislative body, and it required supermajorities, and it couldn't tax, it couldn't conduct foreign policy, it couldn't do anything. It really couldn't govern. And the reason it was set up that way is most of the people of America were coming out of living under British rule, and they did not want to create a system that in any way, shape, or form reflected that. So they set up this Articles of Confederation that really gave no powers to the government. And it was almost like a league of friends where it was kind of like, okay, well, we have 13 different little principalities and nations, and we're just going to help each other out when we need it, I guess, if there's a foreign threat, kind of. And we see the problems with that. There's a rebellion called Shays Rebellion. Basically, some farmers in Western Massachusetts were really upset after the revolution. They were impoverished and the government wasn't helping them out. And they saw some very wealthy individuals who had benefited greatly from the revolution. And they thought that was an injustice and they wanted it fixed. And the government was basically powerless to go back and either A, fight them to quell the rebellion, or B, prevent the or adjust the grievances that they had because they couldn't raise taxes, they couldn't field an army. Long story short, that eventually led to the states recognizing that, hey, we have a problem with this current Articles of Confederation. There's a problem. It cannot govern enough. So we are going to make some compromises to create the U.S. Constitution.
It's important for those on the right to keep in mind that we had at one point in time a very weak federal government, and that was under the Articles of Confederation, and it was not a nice place to live. Like that was not a good time to live because essentially there were quite a few chaotic events, and the people wanted a stronger government to actually do something about stuff like Shays Rebellion, the slave revolts that were occurring in the South. And I say that to say that, one of the most popular talking points on the right these days is limited government. All for limited government. However, it's important to keep in mind that there is a balance. And, this is important in the federalism, Federalist versus anti Federalist case, protecting liberties versus infringing upon liberties. Both take government action, and it's important to keep those things in mind. But yeah, that was a great introduction to how we got here.
I'm gonna say something that libertarians probably won't like to hear, but because they weren't, I didn't say progressives or I said progressives and conservatives. I didn't say libertarians, but if you talk to most libertarians, their political theory is that of like what a 16-year-old would do when their parents are gone for the weekend. They're just like, hey, I want to smoke weed. I want to hook up. Like, okay, how are you going to solve all these issues? I mean, it's like I at one point would have considered myself. I would have said, yeah, I'm a libertarian. I don't want the government to do all these things. And I think about it, and I'm like, well, actually, we kind of do. Otherwise, you're going to get a situation like the Articles of Confederation, and hey, there's a problem, and the government can't fix it, and actually, nobody can. Amazon's not coming to the rescue. So, as much as we want the government to stay out of things, you have to. And I don't mean to bash libertarians too hard, but you have to understand what the founders didn't want no government. They wanted limited government. And what does that actually mean? It doesn't mean that they can't do anything. It means they have a certain set of rules and laws that they can abide by. And it's ultimately to protect your liberty. Jay, I think you said it last week that liberty is is through laws. And these laws in the Constitution are laid out basically to tell the government what it can and can't do in order to protect your liberty and your pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So, I say all that just to say you got to have some government. We've done the libertarian experiment before, and it didn't work out.
No, that's excellent. I am totally going to use that from now on about saying that libertarians are like the 16-year-old. When their parents are gone for the weekend. Any libertarian listening to this podcast, we love you. So please, if you see it a different way, please comment on this. I desperately want to know what the libertarians think of that idea, because that's hilarious.
I'm glad you thought that was funny.
Yeah, I'm totally going to use that on my libertarian friends now. And if any of them are listening, it's coming. So come up with a better counter argument.
I mean, it really is. If you read the Constitution as it is, the government exists for a reason. Like, okay, there are certain enumerated powers within the government. And this is what we're going to talk about with federalism and what federalism actually is. There are certain national powers. There are certain state powers. Some of them overlap. Some of them do not overlap. And that's okay. The founders wanted it that way. They recognized through the Articles of Confederation the weakness of a government, a central government that had zero power, and it was all within the states. They recognized that, and so they said, hey, at a minimum, here's what the federal government needs to do. Hey, and then the states can do all these things. And then I can't can't remember which article it is off the top of my head. But it basically said like if there's a federal law and a state law about the same thing, federal law takes precedent. So like, okay, this all works for everybody. This keeps everybody happy. So sorry about my. I'm
No,
going on. I'm going. I'm getting too fired up now.
no, it's all good. I think it's important. The whole reason why we have a Bill of Rights is because during the Constitutional Convention, the momentum was towards creating a stronger federal government, as opposed to, oh, shoot, the first iteration was too strong and now we need to back off of it, right? They, the founders knew that once you granted power to a higher authority, it was very difficult to take that back, if not impossible, by the way. And we're seeing this in our country today, where in Jay's personal opinion here, the executive branch has way too much authority. And frankly, it is a miracle that we're only recently seeing some, again, checks and balances being applied here. The Not to go off on a different tangent, but just again to talk about current events a little bit. The the Supreme Court ruling that the EPA can't regulate without having a little bit more congressional oversight. That's that's a good thing. And it's a good thing for one very simple reason. The executive branch is not meant to create rules. It's meant to enforce rules. The legislative branch is meant to create rules, not to enforce them. That is the check and balance between those two branches in government. And because the founders put that check in the Constitution, we now, or the executive branch was prevented finally from coming up with its own rules and being able to enforce them. There's got to be a separation between those two things.
No, that now that kickstarted something I'm thinking about here because if anything, those decisions, the judiciary does not create laws. So it's not like the Supreme Court is sitting there and being like, okay, well, this is the new law of the land. What they are basically saying is like, okay, the executive is overstepping their bounds. If you want to create this, looking at the legislative branch, you need to legislate this. You need to
Yeah.
go through the process that has been put in place. And to be honest, I think we're at a point, and we talked about this political cultural conflict right now between left and right, where too often people are looking at each other. They're looking inward, left and right, and blaming one side or the other rather than looking at the Constitution and understanding, like, okay, well, hey, if I want a law passed and I want a law enforced, it needs to go through the legislative branch and it needs to be
Right.
signed by the president or the executive branch. If we want to make it, go to your congressman if you want them to make a change, if you want them to pass a law. But I don't know if it's a congressional laziness, ignorance, or what, or a mixture of both. But a lot of times, I don't think the legislative branch and our current politicians really want to go through that process. It's too politically dangerous for them. Hey, putting your neck out there on this legislation could mean maybe I don't get reelected, maybe I don't make a committee, or cough cough, maybe a lobbyist group doesn't pay me and take me to nice dinners or something like that. So if you want a law passed or a law changed, go to the legislative branch. If anything, these Supreme Court decisions just said, hey, look, they overstepped their bounds. You want to do it the right way. That's it.
Yeah.
That's the simplest
It,
way to put it. Instead of looking at each other, looking left and right, look back to the Constitution.
right. And I would just ask our left-leaning listeners, if Donald Trump was in office, would you want the executive branch to have more or less power? Right? The Because I'm pretty sure the answer to that question is less, right? Because what the Supreme Court just did was it took away power from the executive branch of government. And I think you should ask yourself, are you upset at that because your candidate's in office right now? And then would you be upset if Donald Trump was in office? And this applies to both sides. Like we want the executive branch to be beholden to the legislature for its rules because the legislature is a better representation of the people than the single executive and all of the political appointees that are in the executive branch of government. Um, yeah, so it's meant like we've got to have a more long-term approach here as opposed to, oh, my candidate's in office, so they need to be able to do everything.
Well,
And it goes
man,
both ways.
now we're really going. So I think we need to do a series on the history of political parties and parties in general. But this is the win loss dichotomy that you get into with the two party system. It's like, okay, well, my party's in power. I want them to win at all costs, and if they lose, I'm pissed. But if they win, I'm happy. Without really saying like, well, maybe we don't want them to win whatever they're trying to push now because the other side in 2 years is going to use this against me. And
Yep.
how for progressives, how are you going to what are you going to progress to? What is the aim here? And I think actually, not just for progressives, for everyone. Like as a country, how can we coexist and create laws and stay together as a union if everything is this win-lose situation where, okay, well, I want my candidate, I want to concentrate more power to the right or to the Republicans or to the Democrats based on what political affiliation I have, without looking back at the Constitution and being like, whoa, they're both wrong. They're both overstepping their bounds. They're both doing things incorrectly. Or, so with all that being said, I think we just have to have a series on the political party history and where they came from. But I think it's important to recognize that a lot of this comes from this win-loss dichotomy of I'm a Republican or I'm a Democrat.
No, that's excellent. So again, for you when you ask the question, progressives, what are you trying to progress to? Two two things, 1 point. One, the Constitution, or sorry, the founders would have been viewed as on the political left relative to the context that they were in at the time, monarchists in Great Britain. Two, we should read I'm going to read the preamble to the Constitution because it's explicitly states what the founders were trying to progress to, right? Here we go. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. Those form a more perfect union, establish justice, tranquility, common defense, general welfare, blessings of liberty. That was what the founders were trying to progress to. But one of the key things that differentiates them from maybe the political left today is that it was the goal, right? But especially in the phrase to form a more perfect union, there's a reason why that word more is in there. There's a reason why it doesn't say in order to form a perfect union. They knew it wasn't going to be perfect. There's no utopian ideal here. Rather, it's just, hey, what is a good goal here? And let's work towards that, understanding that we're not there yet.
So that's a good point, talking about a more perfect union. So there's a really good book called "Vindicating the Fathers" by Thomas West, and in it he takes most of the common criticisms of the founders and breaks them down, and it's basically a rebuttal against them. But it's good, and he quotes a guy who, and I'm paraphrasing here, basically says the founders had a lot of problems, and at the time their vision was not fully realized until it wasn't realized until history began to progress, i.e., like, hey, not everyone was free and we didn't have a perfect union at the time, but as history progressed, they were able to realize their vision of a more perfect union 200 years later. I think Thomas West ended up saying like I was right, but for the wrong reasons. But I think it's pretty accurate. And to say that they understood that things were not always going to be the same, and forming a more perfect union provided left and right lateral limits, and they provided a means within those left and right lateral limits to provide liberty for all. And I mean, you can go through different quotes of founders and see that they definitely recognized that there were problems that would be ultimately fixed.
That's good because the main thing I'm trying to push back against here is the error I think a lot of folks on the left make today. Not everyone, but a lot. And this is you don't have to be a Marxist to believe this. So I'm not trying to say that everybody on the left's Marxist because that's not true. However, post Marx, the left has become obsessed with creating a utopia, and that's not possible, right? The founders knew that you can't. And what actually ends up happening when you try to create this utopian dream, and we'll have a future episode on the history of socialism, but when you try to do this, you can only create a perfect society for a certain group of individuals. And what is a perfect society for one group is a horrible society for another group. It actually is anti-diversity. I'll say that again, a little bit louder for the people in the back. Utopian ideals, of which a lot of people on the left are obsessed with these days, is anti-diversity. Therefore, in order to maintain diversity as an objective principle, people need to understand you have to be accepting of certain things that aren't perfect, right? We're not going to be able to create a utopia. We're not going to be able to create perfection. We can continue to strive towards a common goal, right, in order to form a more perfect union. But the only way that we can do that is by accepting the fact that we're not there yet. We can't create a perfect union. Therefore, what's the best possible scenario, the best possible government for our people? That's what the founders were trying to create.
So I think that's important for us as a nation. So you think about like nation building 101. You have to have a common identity and a common goal. And it doesn't have to be, hey, everybody's got the same, they feel the same, they look the same, they act the same. You know, we live in this grand utopia, but it's like, hey, we have this common, our goal is to create a more perfect union. Okay, how do we do that? The Constitution lays something we can all look back to and say, okay, this is where we all have, it right here. It spells it out. We're going, all men are created equal. We know these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. We can all look back to that and say, this is where I'm going to build my foundation as a nation on, that we can move forward together and promote this idea of, this diversity, this non-perfect union, but we're trying to make it more perfect. What I'm trying to say is you have to have a reference point, and the Constitution serves as a perfect reference point for that.
No, that's a really good point. That the founders did not intend the Constitution to solve all the problems for everybody, right? It was meant to fill a power vacuum, right? You talked about the Articles of Confederation, right? The people recognized that there was somewhat of a power vacuum at the federal level. Hey, the Constitution is going to fill that vacuum in the best way that the founders could at the time. And then it's going to serve as a common reference point for how we're going to form a more perfect union for generations and generations to come.
No, Jay, that's good. I think if ultimately we could summarize this is about adding context to the Constitution and a firm understanding, keeping it as a reference point, understanding what their thought process was. And this is part one, everyone. This is going to be a continued series because there's so much to talk about. And there's so much to discuss when we're talking about the Constitution and what it means. And I think we really just spent this past episode kind of breaking it down and we still left there's a lot of meat on the bones for the Constitution that we can talk about, and we're going to continue. So this is really part one.
Yeah. So I think if Colin and I will stop going on tangents, you know what? It's our podcast and we're going to go on whatever tangents we want.
Those tangents make it great. Make it great.
uh, yeah, so we'll actually cover some more specific details of the Constitution on our next episode. But yeah, like Colin was saying, we just wanted to cover the context of where the Constitution came from. Again, Colin, thank you so much for helping organize this episode, and thank you if you're still listening. We appreciate it. Yeah, there's and if you like what we're doing here and you want to support us, like I said at the beginning of the episode, you can support us on Spotify or click the link to our Patreon page. If you're a Patreon, through patreon.com / the loins of history, you can get access to some exclusive content. You have direct access to Colin and I, where we hang out, and you can ask us questions. You can give us feedback on the show. Colin is working on an exclusive mini series on the Supreme Court, and
It's funny you say that. I was thinking about doing one on some famous like sieges throughout history, just for fun. Don't worry, they're only like
oh yeah,
10 to 15 minute episodes, so it's real quick. It's down and dirty, but there's some good miniseries episodes coming up. So those will look for
nice,
those in the next couple days.
yeah, for sure. So thanks again for listening. We really hope y'all are enjoying this. Please feel free to give us some feedback in the comments. If you like what we're doing, ratings and reviews are the best possible thing that you can do to help us get into the algorithm so that Apple and Spotify and Google and Amazon and all those other entities will help promote our podcast for us. So please, 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 5-star review and leave us a rating. If you don't like it, give us some feedback as well. We're definitely open to learning from there. So with that, thank you for joining us on this episode of The Loins of History.